Good afternoon, students, faculty, and community members, and welcome to another weekly policy talk presented by the School of Policy Studies. My name is Christina Thompson. I'm an MPA 2019 candidate. It's my pleasure to host this week's talk. We're fortunate to have Vass Bendar here via Skype to speak with us today on the future of public policy and technology. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting today. Kingston has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years and is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. I'd also like to take a moment, if you'll indulge me, to express my thanks as a graduating student in the PMPA program to the faculty, staff, and a really great group of classmates that have made this a really, truly enriching experience. Now on to my role. I'm here to introduce Vass Bednar. Ms. Bednar is a self-described interdisciplinary wonk focused on ensuring that we have the regulatory structures we need to embrace the future of work and new ways of living. She works as the head of public policy at Delphia, a Toronto-based artificial intelligence company that is working to empower citizens to reclaim the value of their personal data. As a student of the policy-making process, she has held leadership roles at Airbnb, Queen's Park, the City of Toronto, and the University of Toronto. She has also chaired the federal government's expert panel on youth employment. Passionate about public dialogue, she was also the co-host of Detangled, a weekly pop culture and public policy radio show and podcast that ran from 2016 to 2018. Her talk is sure to get us thinking and asking lots of questions. Speaking of questions, a reminder to please use Slido using the hashtag MPA19. And a reminder that if you don't have a question, you can vote on other questions of interest to you, and we will, as we have done in the past, pose the questions with the most votes and take questions from the crowd. Please join me now in welcoming Vass Bendar.
Thank you. As you welcome me, I'm going to say goodbye for a second, start sharing my screen so that we can go through the presentation, but I'm looking forward to your questions and to, continue discussion. What resonates with you, what doesn't. And here we go. All right. You guys know what I'd like to talk about with you. So thank you, Christina, for the introduction. Congratulations on almost graduating. It's very cool to get to speak with you today. I'm very happy that I can video in, and I'm very grateful that this accommodation was made. I think it's appropriate that a technological solution made this possible. And I am sorry I can't be there in person. It is not optimal to not get to connect with you and see your faces as I present, but we're going to do our best. And I just wanted to share a fun fact, which is that my twin brother went to Queen's, so I'm quite fond of your institution. And just before we get started, even though we have started, I do want to offer a disclaimer that everything I'm sharing and talking about today, these are my ideas, which is not to say that we shouldn't react to and interrogate them, but they're not the property of Delphia, they're not Airbnb's ideas, they're not University of Toronto's, and sometimes I think it's just worth clarifying that up front. In order for us to think about the future of policymaking, what technology, what technological changes, what the current technological context means for us as practitioners, I think we're going to have to look at some of the recent trends and tensions in the context of big tech. Ultimately, these considerations should and do apply to small and medium-sized enterprises in the space, but too often I think they end up falling under the radar. Our conversation today will be a little bit more descriptive than prescriptive, but we can dig more into prescriptive things during our Q&A, during our dialogue. My ultimate goal, I'll be transparent about that, is to plant seeds regarding where you can and should carve out your careers as policy people in Canada. This is not a surprise. I mean, here's what a surprise is maybe. I suck at making slides. These are my best slides. Wait till you see them. But so much of the public dialogue around public policy and technology is over-focus on big tech, right? The FANGs, they totally dominate. Big tech is an important starting point. It can be a hinge for really important policy conversations. And we're having policy discussions in Canada, especially around Facebook and Google when it comes to political advertising. But if over-focusing on the FANGs ultimately obscures the significance of other technological actors that are in our own backyard. I think another challenge just conceptually with the FANGs is that they're American, which can make it seem as if the issues that they raise aren't really a Canadian problem. And that's why it's so critical for policymakers to spend time and attention organizing our governance institutions so that we can be thoughtfully proactive in this space. Okay, this space is tough to talk about because there's so much going on within it, right? Artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, home sharing and ride sharing, I feel in many ways are very 2014, but we're having conversations about them in Canada still. Scooters, digital rights, consumer protection, privacy, and more. I will venture to you that our status quo in Canada, and maybe this is happening elsewhere, but frankly, I'm most familiar with Canadian policymaking, our status quo of lazy reactionism is not sustainable. Again, my hope is that many of you from this class will graduate, or faculty who are probably already engaged in many ways in this work, will graduate and go on to tackle this work in substantial ways. And let's create some urgency. Why do I care so much about this? Why are we talking about it today? I think that if government doesn't continue to get that balance with technology, technological innovation, right, and maintain the trust of citizens and maintain that trusted status as a governance institution, that we threaten our economic outcomes, right? Because they're only going to be as good as the regulatory environments that introduce those guardrails for them. That's not an argument against regulation. I think there's also often this idea that working in the technology space or, having worked privately in public policy, that all regulation is, bad and should be avoided. This is an argument for responsive, flexible, and ultimately anticipatory policy development. My sense as an observer, and I'll indulge myself and say I'm a practitioner, is that government's ability to do this, to better balance the desire to create valuable technology companies, to train competitive talent, and introduce relevant public policy that supports productivity and competition, in Canadian is uncertain. And our current approach is inconsistent and uncoordinated. Ultimately, it's embarrassing. So what's going on? Look, this is not a comprehensive slide of everything going on related to technology and policymaking in Canada, but we're iterating. We're making these small interventions. We have a federal directive on ethical AI. It's pretty new. It's pretty cool. It's great. We had a national consultation on digital and data rights, but we still have no strategy. Many people were anticipating that a strategy would be mentioned in the federal budget from earlier this week. The federal government is helping companies more with intellectual property rights. That's important. It's an important source of value and competitiveness. And then we have this variability across Canada. And one of those sources of variability, and really good examples in Quebec, where Quebec provincially now has a law that compels platforms to pay sales tax on their service fees. But when it comes to that inconsistency, yes, it's federalism, but that's not happening in other provinces. So is that a space where we should have more federal leadership? Is it a space where we're going to see more federal leadership? There are a few tech-related supportive pieces, again, from the federal budget earlier this week. This is not comprehensive either. I was pretty into reading about how we're going to bring innovation to regulations by introducing regulatory roadmaps. This is a continued part of sector-specific conversations that have been happening. From an immigration perspective, we're making global talent stream pilot permanent. We're doubling down on our work to ensure reliable and comprehensive broadband penetration across the country. It is a good thing. We've expanded the eligibility for a particular tax incentive. But overall, there's no narrative, there's no ownership, and I don't know that the public policy part is always our priority. What I'm observing in Canada is a kind of delayed replication. And this is a challenge for policymakers because we like to do jurisdictional scans, right? And this isn't public policy by Google. You have to know what's out there. You need to know what other jurisdictions are doing. You need to take those lessons. But in many of these spaces and with these policy questions, it's just new ground. So we can't rely on situating ourselves against everyone else. That's a leadership opportunity. That's a policy leadership opportunity for Canada that we are not taking advantage of. I don't have the time in this lecture, which is still completely going to be a drive-by of policy issues and opportunities that are broadly related to technology, to dig deeply into sidewalk labs and the debates that are happening here in Toronto. But I do think it's worth recognizing, because I think 2018 was a really historic year in this regard, how the sidewalk labs conversations and the Amazon H2Q shortlist highlighted just how desperate the state is for alternative sources of revenue and jobs. Now, I don't know if that's a moment in time, or I don't know if that's the future, but we need to pay attention. Speaking of paying attention, the very same day that here in Toronto, people were tweeting about how sidewalk labs shouldn't be permitted to receive a portion of the developer fees derived from Quayside. They were chirping about how the City of Toronto should also pay more to remove snow from sidewalks. These were two different but parallel sidewalk debates that really hit home how much we can't afford the city we want. You can substitute that with province, you can substitute that with country, and that we're not going to increase property taxes anytime soon, that we don't have new reliable sources of income to offset that. I don't know how Toronto will be able to invest more in clearing sidewalks. It's a good idea, we need it, but I also don't know how we'll ever be able to build the transit that connects the Portlands without reconciling with either big tech or technology in general. And ultimately, my worry is that with this generation, our generation, we could start to see less of a role for the state overall as a result. So forget a robot taking your job. For me, that's, it's just not the most dangerous possible outcome. It's that our reluctance to be more proactive from a policy perspective will create a gap that technology will fill. Sometimes the state is something that just says no to something new. That's a danger too. A good example of this is Car2Go, which I have renamed Car2Gone because it left the City of Toronto versus Waze. Now, sharing vehicles, reducing the number of cars overall on the road, shared mobility, smaller cars, these are all good things. We generally seem to have agreement that they're desirable. But in the City of Toronto, we couldn't get right parking overnight, right? Previously, Car2Go was restricted or had some kind of deal with Green P parking. People in neighborhoods were getting upset that the cars might be able to park overnight on residential streets. A lot of friction was created. I'm not saying it's the right move. Car2Go made a decision to remove themselves from that market, from that jurisdiction. Now, younger people, people without vehicles, people who can't afford vehicles no longer have that option. Okay, it's not necessarily a technology, it's a new business. But in that mobility space, another case study is what the City of Toronto is doing with the company Waze. I think it's from late 2017, but the city has a data sharing agreement with Waze. That's pretty neat. So the City of Toronto is sharing data with Waze that they have from their traffic control, And Waze is sharing data with the city. So in a way, you might be able to say that the city of Toronto is somewhat enriching Waze as a platform, as something that people are using for mobility in the city. These two things are happening at the same time. That is not a coherent approach to new technologies, to innovation, to what's happening in our backyard. And I want to ring that bell overall. I don't want to like stress people out on a Friday afternoon, but I actually think there is a bit of technological creep happening whereby technology is incrementally taking on what was previously the role of the state. Let me give you one example. I actually think this company, .health, is a very good example. Frankly, it's just a startup's answer to Ontario's failure on e-health. It's a great solution. You pay a monthly fee out of pocket. I think it's about $10 to access your own aggregated, digitized medical records. However, if I'm willing to do that, if I'm agree that this should be, the cost burden should be held by the individual, then what do I see as the role of the provincial health ministry to be able to digitize my records or their ability to receive these records? Maybe there's a different end game with this work. Innovation often comes from the outside. Maybe e-health should have always been, tendered or an RFP or a competition so that we could have outsourced it. But I just think it's an important dimension to take a step back and recognize what is this work and what does it mean for policymakers. I'd like us to keep our eyes on it, and I'd like to challenge you to keep your eyes on it. Last shout out to .health because they are doing something, it's really great. Like I do cherish their intervention and what they're working on. So here's the moment as I see it. When it comes to potential economic growth, it seems that our main hope to progress beyond what many call sloth is something that we call innovation. Okay, it can be a little bit vague, but Minister Baines wants 10 Shopifys. He said this many times. Apparently, for Canada's economy, one Shopify, not going to cut it. At the same time, the state is so starved for resources that it is bidding for satellite offices. So we're in this kind of really interesting moment where we are simultaneously courting big tech, trying to create it in our own backyard, furiously working on that, and seeking to appropriately regulate it. Let's run through, since I'm shouting out Shopify so much, a recent report did say that Canada has 28 companies on track to become unicorns in the near future. A great question for us as policymakers is what the state did and also didn't do to facilitate, these high potential companies. Let's run through some of the political realities of regulating tech. That'll get us closer to the future of policymaking. I do think that technology policy broadly suffers an invisibility politically. I know that federally we have the innovation minister, but ultimately we are still slow and territorial and often reluctant to lead from a legislative perspective. There's a great agenda episode, actually pretty recent, not that we have time to watch it together, but Getting Canada Ready for the Future that I recommend too. In her introduction, Christina referenced that I spent 2 years doing public policy work for Airbnb here in Canada. You probably know that Kingston's currently considering regulations for home sharing, which is fantastic. We absolutely need the clarity. It's quite overdue. But the other thing is just that Airbnb is a 10-year-old company, right? So if that's our reaction time, if that's the lag from something being created and adopted to us clarifying those guardrails and policy, is that sustainable? Is that going to work for these other spaces like micromobility and autonomous vehicles and even, cannabis, which we're on the verge of? The edible piece is a fascinating implementation challenge. One tech space that's totally invisible politically is political ads and online advertising, critical for a strong democracy. But again, I think Google and Facebook end up sucking up all the air and, ultimately preventing us from thinking about smaller companies, smaller interventions that are happening now. The tension, and this tension is not historically new, but I think it's definitely become much, much more pronounced, is that technical advances, they're not necessarily incompatible or complementary to government. One Shopify is not enough. The government has become more focused on collaboratively solving what's referred to as Canada's scale-up problem. So when does regulation happening? Is it post-scaling up? Is it after scaling up? Is it something that enables firms to scale? Another tension comes from the policy lever of taxation. Not that that's too blunt a lever, but it's something reliable that we're able to talk about. I mentioned Quebec's work on the QST. The EU was recently discussing a digital tax, but backed away. What is Canada's position on these things? Are we going to be a leader, or are we going to be a follower? Are we able to articulate what our approach is? Just before we talk about othering, one to watch, the state of California is putting forward really, I think, brave and bold policy proposals around privacy and data that we can learn a lot from, and that I'm sure people are watching closely across Canada. Another tension is just the reality that government is increasingly considered to be a vector for scaling, and that's the role that it kind of holds. That's not a bad thing. Government probably should scale productive, reliable, innovations and interventions that are coming from somewhere else. But again, what does government as a vehicle for scaling mean for how a generation or how we perceive the role of the state? And all that does go to something I've touched on but haven't labeled it othering, but I have observed a bit of an othering in tech, right? So we can be inconsistent in our approach to moderate or curb the activity of the broad tech stack. We are company specific. We can't be that selective going forward. This approach is in and of itself undemocratic. We've vilified FANGs, but we elevate homegrown heroes. Let's go back to Shopify for a second. No one's ever called on Shopify to share information on their sellers that make over $30,000 a year with the CRA, or to automatically charge HST or GST, right? No one puts them in the crosshairs, probably because that wouldn't be great politically. But if we're going to put other companies in that position, should we look at Shopify in that way? And not to pick on Shopify because they've done amazing things, but I mean, Etsy also has a similar halo, right? So why are some technology companies, why are some platforms outside of the FANGs better than others, or more immune to our calls for moderation through regulation? What do we regulate? When do we take a wait-and-see approach? Should we be invigorated by a shallow jurisdictional scan or invigorated by it? These are the opportunities for policy leadership, pilots, innovation, and iteration. When it comes to the future of technology and policymaking, yes, public policy needs more technologists, but technology needs much more public policy. We do have to grow out of this very primitive idea that policy is an inhibitor to a tech company or to the tech sector. I do believe that the days of what's often called regulatory entrepreneurship is over, but often when we talk about regulatory entrepreneurship, we blame the companies that have benefited from, not even an absence, but a lack of clarity from a regulatory perspective. Is that a company's fault, or is that a public policy failure? I think you can look at it both ways. Increasingly, I do think companies, small and medium size, and of course, even the FANGs, view policy expertise as a competitive advantage in the landscape. That said, the most recent Edelman, probably saying it wrong, trust survey, one of their key results that I think was really interesting is that 76% of respondents, that's 76% or 3/4, not 76 and 3/4, said that CEOs should take the lead on change rather than wait for government to impose it. Is that support for self-regulation, for companies to one by one do different things in different jurisdictions? Is that a lack of trust in the state's ability to lead on change? Should we be excited by this or nervous about it? I think the next era of the quote unquote digital revolution is the regulatory era. It's not the sexiest sentence I've ever said, but it is the premise of the best policy book that I read last year. It's called Regulatory Hacking, a Playbook for Startups. The book's all about finding creative strategic approaches to navigating complex markets and working with government, has a very favorable role of the state, and acknowledges just the reality that we live in a regulated and regulatory space. And we need to be thinking about that. And just because something isn't clear or currently permitted doesn't mean that we need to update structures or modernize them. Let me run through a couple more books that I wanted to make sure I recommend. Platform Capitalism, if you'd like to learn more about that, I literally do recommend the book Platform Capitalism by Nick Shrenick. The Fixer is a nice companion read to Regulatory Hacking. It's part memoir by a gentleman named Bradley Tusk. He was the first policy person, I guess, for Uber. He was paid in equity. So he is now a venture capitalist, but he has a particular view about the politics of policymaking that I think make it a really good chaser. Back to incredible policy books, and apologies if a class has already assigned you these, but Everybody Lies was my favorite policy book of the year before. Big data, new data, and what the internet can tell us about who we really are. It was a bit mismarketed. I think they were going for kind of like a Gladwell feel. But what it's ultimately about is that intimacy of the Google search bar. And the Everybody Lies part is the fact that we all dress ourselves up a little bit in an outward-facing way on the internet, which is not a surprise. My Facebook account, I don't have Facebook, but I know what it is, might say that my favorite boy band is the Backstreet Boys. However, my Spotify says that I always listen to NSYNC. Whoa. To my mind, that wasn't the most interesting takeaway from this book. It's realizing and recognizing how much policy relevant information Google has just from that toolbar. Here's an example. After the 2008 recession, in the hardest hit areas, social workers were bracing for a spike, for an increase in reported child abuse. They looked at their paperwork a couple of years later and said, hey, that's really great, we didn't see a spike. When you geocode search histories, you actually do see significant growth in searches like, why is dad mad all the time? Why did mom hit me? What do we do with that information? Now, sometimes in criminal cases, yes, we are, authorities are able to access messages, things like this. But if Google knows, back to public health, if Google knows that if I search sore boob and upset stomach in that order, that I have an X%, substantially higher risk of or likelihood of having breast cancer, what does the internet owe me, if anything, in terms of identifying that? We didn't talk about artificial intelligence at all. We can talk about it during the Q&A. I think AI superpowers is absolutely a must-read for policymakers today, understanding the talent race, how AI is changing how we work, complementing how we work, and also changing economic globe. I can't see this. It says subscribe to the logic. I can't see the logic because my screen's in black and white because of my concussion. But if you don't feel like reading all those books and you're like, man, I'm trying to finish this semester, why is Vass making me read all these books? You don't have to read them, but you should also subscribe to the logic. It is a subscription-based media startup that looks at Canada's innovation economy. The daily newsletter is free, and then if you pay, you get their daily in-depth news reporting. I think they have a sale on right now. Maybe Queen's has a subscription you can tap into. If Queen's doesn't, talk to your librarians, and maybe you can hook that up. This whole chat has been predicated on our weak ability, what I think is our weak ability to navigate the relationship between government and technology. I do want to plant that seed around what does or should or could technology owe government, especially in a context where we're talking about severe data deficits that are impeding our ability to make the best possible decisions as policymakers. Do we need to have more complementary data sets? how else can we innovate when we're trying to predict GDP or doing certain things with Statistics Canada? So quick summary. We need to pick up pace of policymaking. This may mean more experimentation, iteration, pilots. We ultimately need to collaborate on better and more data sets. It's going to be the technology sector that has a strong role there. We can talk more about what that could look like. Many of tech's policy issues lack visibility. Investing in innovation can be incompatible with our current regulatory approach. To date, that approach overall has been inconsistent, and I will venture unsatisfactory. And this all plays into that changing codependent relationship between technology and government. Thanks, guys.